Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking a little bit about how I used the Yin book and the Hodgkins and Hodgkins article to shape the design of my dissertation study. So hopefully this will work. Let's see. Okay, so Yin starts with a research question as a way to help determine what type of study to conduct. He has this nice handy table to help us decide based on our research question whether or not the researcher has any control or whether the phenomenon of interest is contemporary or not. So he identifies case study as being the appropriate research methodology for questions that begin with how or why, that don't require any control from the researcher and are contemporary. Yin also gives us some other criteria and decision-making points about selecting case study approaches. So I actually started with unusual, or in my case, sort of uncommon, as a starting point for why I wanted to do a case study. So cradle to career networks, there are about 50 of them in the United States that use the Strive model, and of those, a very small handful are in rural places, and so that makes them really rare. This rarity suggests case study methods. I also knew that it was going to be a contemporary phenomenon, and I wanted to look at how these networks were really forming in the real world in the immediate time frame. So that decision then in turn helped me shape my research question, which I have 3 different questions that are sort of interrelated. And you'll notice that they all have how in them. So how do community and organization members mobilize in the development of a cradle-to-career network? How do community and organizational members frame issues in the development of a cradle-to-career network? And then how do those 2 things impact the theory of action development? So in this case, instead of starting with the research question and then moving towards method, I kind of started with what I wanted to study, the methodology, and then worked backwards towards an appropriate question. And so for me, I really was focused on sort of these ideas of process. How do things actually happen or work in the real world? And then Yin also says that case studies provide in-depth description of social phenomena. So this really, this methodology allowed me to really sort of dig deep and develop thick descriptions of what was happening in the real world. Thick descriptions focus on relationships between people in their context in ways that other research just doesn't. So in my literature review, I also found that there were a lot of black boxes. The researchers would say, oh, you really need to bring stakeholders together. But they wouldn't really offer any details on how that was done. And so those were the things that I wanted to find out about. How do you bring stakeholders together? So again, case study works for things that are happening right now. And the network I chose developed between 2009 and 2014. And I was in the field in November of 2014 and June of 2015. And this time frame allowed me to gather data on 2 sort of ongoing rounds of mobilization, as well as some that had occurred in the recent past. Case studies also focus on real-world content, which I felt aligned with rural research really well. Rural communities differ greatly in their context, including just simply the geography of the spaces that they occupy, and that geography often shapes the society and cultures within them. So in particular, qualitative approaches to case study maintain the voices and perspective of those who live in rural places. So that was really important to me as well. Case studies are also appropriate when context and phenomena are hard to tease apart. And this decision was really supported by how many people in my study talked about how the rural context was sort of part and parcel and how they brought stakeholders together and how they thought about the problems in their communities. So the next important question in case study is, what is the unit of analysis? Yin says case studies can be an individual, a program, an organization, a city. It really just depends on what you're looking at in your research question. So in my case, I could have used the county, but that seems sort of too broad and messy because the network actually included areas that were in parts of other counties. So I settled on the network itself, which aligned with my questions. And it also helped me to limit my study to people just in the network. So that helped me determine who I was going to recruit for my interviews and my focus groups. Um, and so as much as I wanted to know from people why they weren't engaged, why they didn't go to meetings, I kind of tabled that for a future project. So some other justifications or reasons we would use case study research from the Hodgkins and Hodgkins article. Case studies are useful when there's complex interrelationships. So I knew from the literature review on cradle-to-career networks and things that had come before them that multi-sector collaborative partnerships include a lot of factors. There's organizational factors, there's individual level factors, all of these things are sort of interrelated. And I started to see cradle-to-career networks as a complex solution to a complex problem. So I knew there was just going to be a lot of complexity in interrelationships. They also say case study is good for lived reality. Again, that's really important in rural research, is maintaining the perspectives of people who live in those communities and maintaining their voices. They also say that it's useful for exploration of unexpected and unusual situations. And as I said earlier, cradle-to-career networks in rural places are really rare. So that provided me a good tool to just focus really on one of these sort of unusual organizational partnerships. So Hodgkins also say that case studies are good for looking at the processes involved in causal relationships. So instead of relying on statistical analysis to help us understand causality, we can actually go into the field and sort of observe what's happening and talk to people about the processes involved. And lastly, it facilitates conceptual development. So I started my study with a really strong theoretical framework, and although it wasn't actually in my research question anywhere, part of what I wanted to know was whether that theoretical framework actually described what was happening in a cradle-to-career network and whether or not it could actually be used in a rural place. And so I think my findings allowed me to sort of push the conceptualization of civic capacity a little bit further into understanding that it's not one directional, that it's in fact cyclical in nature, and that it does map pretty well to what's going on in the cradle-to-career network and can be used in a rural place. Some other considerations in designing a case study from Yin, different areas of validity that we need to pay attention to in our design. So I'll talk a little bit about those and how I considered them in the design of my project. So the first is construct validity. Yin says multiple sources of evidence, creating a chain of evidence, and using member checking during the data collection and composition phases. So I had interviews, focus groups, meeting observations, and some documents. So I had multiple sources of data. I knew that going into the field. Chain of evidence, making sure that all of my data were labeled. So all of my interview protocols were labeled with initials, the person's role in the network, and their sort of organizational home base. So like who was their employer and what role they played. I made sure they were dated and otherwise labeled so that I could kind of keep track of everything. And then I used member checking at 2 points. I wrote summary reports of each of my field visits and sent those out. And then when I was writing up the final case study, I sent it out. And that actually ended up being really, really useful. There were people who talked about school consolidation as if it had just happened. People were very upset about it, very frustrated. And when I member checked, I found out that it actually happened in the 1960s and that people had just sort of held on to this frustration and anger for a really long time. And that little piece of information sort of changed my interpretation of some of those frustrations. So internal validity happens during the analysis phase using pattern matching, explanation building, rival explanations, and logic models. The one I want to talk most about right here is rival explanations. In a lot of cases, I would hear the same thing over and over again. So it's easy to start thinking, well, teachers aren't engaged in the network because they don't have the time. People said that to me a lot. Teachers are just too busy, or meetings are during the school day, they just can't be there. And one person said to me, well, I think teachers are afraid to stand up and say what's wrong in schools. They're afraid to say 26 kindergartners is too many because they'll get fired. And so that idea of fear and distrust gave me a whole different approach to the rest of my data. So I started looking for areas where there were aspects of a lack of trust or active distrust. And I found that kind of, even when people said there were logistical barriers, that in fact there might be undercurrents of a lack of trust in why people didn't get involved. External validity in a single case study occurs during the research design and using theory. So I said I had a really strong theoretical framework based on civic capacity, and I'm sort of in the process of working on a replication study, which is also going to add external validity across all of the cases when I do that. Then reliability, having a case study protocol. That also happens in the design and data collection. So going into the field, I had interview protocols, I had focus group protocols, I had a document collection protocol. For all of my protocols, I would have a little checklist with just a little word reminder, so I made sure that as I was going through and having conversations with people that I made sure I asked all the questions, or if somebody had addressed a question before I had asked it, that way I didn't go back and ask it again. So that really helped me keep track and make sure that I was collecting all of the data I needed. Yeah, so that's really it on validity, but definitely things to be aware of as you're designing your study. So case study is not for everything, and there's some limitations to think about. Some of them are practical and some of them are not. So Hodgkins and Hodgkins say you might end up with too much data. I would say that was probably a little bit true for my dissertation. I was originally going to do a cross case, and when my second case fell through, I convinced my committee to let me go back. So I ended up with a lot of data, and that made it a lot harder to analyze. Case studies can be really expensive. If you need to travel and be in the field, that adds up really quickly. Transcription adds up. And I would say it's never too soon to start thinking about how you're going to pay for your research if you're going to go and do field work. So looking at opportunities in the university to find funding and outside of the university. There was a dissertation scholarship at UAlbany through Grad Studies. There was also money through the Graduate Student Association. And I applied for a lot of different grants and fellowships, which I didn't get, but good experience. And lastly, and I think this is probably the most important, is that complexity is hard to represent in a simple way. And so we know going into a case study, we're doing it because we're expecting to find a lot of complexity. And so as we go to write it up, it's challenging to know where to start. So I'm going to just show you a couple slides, some of which you've already seen to kind of think about complexity. So this is the structure of the network that I was looking at. So you can see that there's a lot of interconnected relationships. So when you start to go write about these relationships, where do you even start? How do you lead your reader through this in a linear fashion that's going to make sense? It's really challenging. This too. So this is the theory of action that I derived from talking to people. Again, a lot of different arrows and a lot of relationships. How do you start talking about this in a way that is linear and clear? It's really challenging. We've seen this one before, so everything that was on the previous slide actually goes in that pink box that says theory of change. So in some ways, visualizations can help us provide another opportunity to, help our readers along and think in a nonlinear fashion, because a lot of what we might be studying is nonlinear. Some other limitations: case studies can be hard to represent numerically. They're not necessarily generalizable to the universe or even specific populations. They can be easy to dismiss. Your reader might say, oh, well, that was just that one case. And again, they're not appropriate for all questions. It really says why and how questions are the appropriate ones for case study. And just a little bit, as I said, I'm working on developing a cross-case analysis from my dissertation. I'm going to add 2 additional cases that are going to give me information on different models, different types of rural communities, and allow me to identify commonalities and differences across them. And so it's also going to help me test the theory that I derived from my first case study about that sort of dynamic nature of civic capacity, and then start to increase the generalizability of my findings. So that's it for that. If you are interested in case study as a methodology, I am going to be teaching a full semester course in the spring, and I would be happy to talk to you about what that course is going to be like and get you the information to register. Thanks.